Aloha. Welcome to the Engagement Party and Rainbow Town Hall brought to you by the Hawaii LGBT Legacy Foundation. I am Dr. Sandy Livingston, and we want to thank Sasha Issenberg and our illustrious panelists for participating in tonight's momentous event. It is with the generous help of community members and supporters like you that we are able to bring this discussion to our ohana. With that, I'll turn this evening over to our host and moderator, Dean Hammer. Dean?
Aloha, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. I'm really looking forward to this evening. You know, being a transplant to Hawaii myself, I really notice out here how infrequently Hawaii is part of the national conversation, but in fact, we've been a big part of several important movements, and we're gonna hear about one of the most important, the marriage movement today. And I'm so delighted to invite Sasha to come and tell us about his book. He's in New York, I believe.
In Los Angeles, actually.
In Los Angeles. So he's coming to us across the water through the miracle of Zoom. And I'm really looking forward to hearing some more about your book. And I just wanted to start by asking you, when did you get the idea for this book? When did you start out?
So sort of 2011, I had the germ of an idea for this. And my last big book was called The Victory Lab, and it was about the science of political campaigns. And I spent a lot of time through 2011 when I was working on it, talking to pollsters or people who studied public opinion in some form or another. And they would often bring up, in the service of making some other point, mention that they had never seen opinion move on a single issue the way that they had on marriage. And nobody had a really good explanation for what had happened. And that sort of stuck with me. And I remember that the night that the New York State Senate voted for the marriage equality bill that Cuomo signed that evening, and CNN went live to a scene outside of Stonewall, outside the Stonewall Tavern in Greenwich Village, where a small crowd had gathered. But there was this sort of effort to put this in a 40 or 50-year arc of gay rights history, and I realized that I had, been alive through the entirety of the fight over same-sex marriage. People are already starting to talk about it as the defining civil rights movement, social movement of my lifetime. And we didn't have a kind of public historical vocabulary of the way we do with Stonewall, or, I didn't know who the Rosa Parks of this movement was. I didn't know what the Haymarket riots of this movement was. And nobody had really, set out to write the whole story of this. People had bitten off little chunks of it in places, but nobody had sort of stitched it together as a big national story. And I had, starting in high school and college, I'd read some of the big books about the civil rights movement that mostly journalists started writing in the late 1970s. Taylor Branch, Richard Kluger, Tony Lucas, Dave Garrow. Those, it seemed to me that this was sort of an analogous defining civil rights movement for my generation, and that the time had come to apply some of those same journalistic tools to writing a sort of work of recent history. And so I sold my book proposal in June of 2012, and it's been sort of the bulk of what I've been working on since then.
I noticed in reading through the history that there are so many cases where people changed their mind, or people were influenced because they had some personal connection. Somebody came out that they didn't know about, or they had a gay son or a lesbian daughter. And I'm just curious, since I understand you're married to a woman, about how you personally gotten involved, and whether there was any personal involvement, or was it purely an academic question?
It was a sort of journalistic curiosity that I had. I mean, I'd never written about. I'd been a political reporter at a newspaper and been written for magazines, and I'd written a lot about politics in an era when this was probably the most contentious domestic social issue that we face as a country. And I'm assumed that at some point I must have typed the words gay marriage in a story. I'd never written a single thing about this. It was not an area in which I had a deep personal connection. I knew gay folks who were in I'm straight. I knew gay folks who were in relationships and either were getting married or wanted to get married and eventually got married, but it was not something that I had a particular personal connection or attachment to. I mean, I'm you know, but I was interested in this as I mean, initially I was drawn to this as just I've written a lot about politics, and this is it seemed like a really compelling story because it sort of fused these local and state level fights with ultimately national and federal policy making, moved sort of through the legal system in the courts while moving through the political process, through legislatures and the ballot. And I thought that the sort of scope of that was really compelling, with this underlying question of how do people change their opinion, which is, basically, we went from a quarter of the country supporting same-sex marriage 25 years ago, when pollsters started asking about this regularly, to, it's now at about 2/3. And this seemed, going into it, like the type of issue where people's opinions would be very hardened because it's grounded in ideas of tradition, morality, religion. And it turned out that we saw an instance of, what's soon going to be like a majority of the country has shifted their views on something. And that just seemed a really big story that somebody ought to tackle.
I agree. That is the big question. And it's so different than some other issues. Like if you look at abortion, there's hardly been any movement in public opinion at all over time. What does your book tell us about the reason for that? I know it's a complicated question, but what's the answer?
Yeah, so I think that obviously the biggest factor, and we see this in polling going back, that the biggest determinant of views on any gay rights question, not just marriage, is basically from polling, what is an individual's response to the question, do you have a friend, coworker, family member who's gay or lesbian, and when that first started getting asked in the late 1970s, the number was pretty close to 0, and now it's pretty close to 100. And that has always been, a determinant. And one of the things that's important, I thought a lot while working on this book about the analogies to women's rights movements, to movements for racial equality, to, sort of the other big defining social movements of in our country's history. And one thing that's just really important to think about sexual orientation is people, unlike race or gender, individuals control the conditions under which they disclose, acknowledge, identify. And, I'm no expert in the science of this, Dean, but correct me if you think I'm wrong. I would presume that the percentage of the U.S. population that's gay or lesbian is the same as it was in the late 70s when pollsters started asking, but that the share of people who identify as gay is obviously much larger. And this seems like maybe a banal observation, but I think important to make, is that certainly unlike issues of race or ethnicity, gays and lesbians are evenly distributed through the population. They're born to straight parents. And so, clearly some significant engine of this change was people, there being, discerning some culture of receptivity, coming out, people around them realizing that they know gay people, that leading other people to come out and creating sort of a political environment of receptivity. And that's sort of the foundation, I think, under which all this has to be seen. And, you just see huge generational differences in support for basically every gay rights question, and so, I think that the dynamics of marriage as an issue are different than some other gay rights or LGBT rights issues defined broadly. But it is, that's just makes it different than a lot of other identity-based social movements we've seen as a country.
Right. So to get a little bit more into the details of this, another question that predicts people's views of LGBT and of marriage is whether you think being gay is natural or is it something that people choose. It's a pretty strong predictor, not as strong as knowing a gay person. But one of the interesting things that happened was when scientists began to get answers to that question in around 1993, a very pivotal year, there then started what's been a very strong continuing increase in belief that being gay was just part of nature and that it was something people were born with. But what's interesting is if you really dig down, you find that all of that increase is because Democrats believe it more. They look at the science, they believe it more. And at exactly the same time, Republicans start believing that less.
Oh, wow.
It's like the information drove it. In the case of marriage, was it both Democrats and Republicans who are getting better, or did it actually make Republicans worse because suddenly they're hearing about all the horrors of gay marriage from the various sources that you
so support for gay marriage from the mid 90s, when people start polling this regularly, which is basically in the wake of the Bear decision in Hawaii. That's what is the first time that national pollsters have any interest in asking about this question, right? Is an almost straight line that averages like 4 or 5% increase per year, which is significant, with a few blips. And there's a blip around the Defense of Marriage Act, where it takes a little hit. And there's a blip in 2004, which is when there's a push for the federal marriage amendment, and 13 states end up passing constitutional bans, basically in some version of response to Massachusetts to marry same-sex couples. And so those are sort of indications of backlash, as we would describe it. And I think a lot of that was, at that point, the issue was pretty polarized. There were no prominent Republicans in the country who supported same-sex marriage rights. In 2004, there weren't many prominent Democrats who supported same-sex marriage rights. I mean, only a handful of U.S. senators did. But now what we've seen is that the movement is, Democrats almost universally support same-sex marriage rights, and we're now at a majority of Republicans. And what I think has kind of gone away, certainly in the last 6-7 years, is elite cues on this have disappeared because politicians just aren't talking about it anymore. And so, I think we'd be in a very different world if Donald Trump had spent the last 5 years beating up on gay couples who were getting married as opposed to immigrants, or, women, or what Muslims, or whatever other group he was targeting on a given day. But so the remarkable thing is how it sort of has shifted out of a partisan dynamic, and it probably makes it a lot easier now for Republicans to say that they support gay marriage because they're not really going against their partisan identity.
Right. So speaking of that, you sort of made your name well known by looking at the science of politics and how politics uses science to guide what they're going to do. And I'm curious, looking over the whole marriage fight, which is over many years and a lot of different movements, how important was that sort of scientific analysis, polling? Were there any experiments that were actually done in guiding strategies versus it's just, we're going to do it, let's do it.
So it doesn't shape the strategy. And the strategy among gay marriage supporters, I write about a big strategy session that takes place in Jersey City, of all places, in 2005, where a group of litigators and representatives of gay rights organizations set a plan to bring a successful case before the U.S. Supreme Court by 2025. That was people thinking strategically about what it would take to create an environment where the court would feel comfortable doing this, what it would take on a state-by-state basis to win marriage or civil unions or other recognition in different states. But the tactics and techniques and mechanics of those state-level campaigns ended up being shaped by this type of research. And it's really in the period between 2010 and 2012 where you see that. And what's happened is that at that point, that's the first time that the sort of gay marriage campaigns get unified enough. There's a large source of funding from a handful of exceedingly wealthy gay men, led by Tim Gill, who's a software mogul, I guess we call him, in Colorado. And they end up backing, hundreds of millions of dollars into these campaigns, and also start finding a way structurally to shape the way campaigns are run in the states, which has been a constant source of tension between national organizations and the state groups that actually run these state level campaigns. And so, I write about how a group called Freedom to Marry, whose founder Evan Wolfson was the co-counsel in the Bear trial in Hawaii in September 1996. Created a kind of research unit with a lot of this funding from these wealthy donors to kind of revisit a lot of the assumptions about how they communicate on marriage. And that includes experiments, a lot of focus groups and data analysis. And one of the big shifts that you see during that period is away from a form of political messaging that focused on what they call rights and benefits. A lot of the messaging that you saw in Hawaii in the 1990s in the public sphere was focused on, there are these discrete benefits in this case in state statutes, hospital visitation rights, property transfer, spousal privilege in court, stuff like that. And gays and lesbians are being denied those because they can't marry on equal terms to opposite sex couples. And to some extent, that messaging was a victim of its own success, which is, that was the sort of that messaging and its arguments in court were part of what convinced the Vermont Supreme Court to award civil union, or basically instruct the legislature to award civil unions even when they weren't ready to go all the way to marriage. And by 2010, gay marriage campaigners have basically split the country into roughly 3 equal sections. There are about a third of the country at that point is supports same-sex marriage rights. About a third of the country is just like fundamentally anti-gay and against a lot of LGBT rights issues. And then the last chunk is what they called the movable middle, and these were folks who were not fundamentally anti-gay or homophobic, were overwhelmingly said that they knew somebody who was gay or lesbian, and they supported civil unions by and large. And the hurdle there in the messaging was that, to some extent, they'd been successful in convincing those people that gay and lesbian couples deserved all of the same legal protections that straight couples are entitled to, but they had failed at convincing those people that gay people deserve the right to marry, and that those were seen as sort of two separate political objectives. And the success, the challenge was, and you see this reflected in ultimately the messaging in 4 state level campaigns that are successful in 2012, was finding ways to communicate to this sort of movable middle that basically gays and lesbians don't want to get married for a discrete roster of legal rights and benefits, because you could find a way through the political process to give them those and not let them marry, but that they want to get married for the same reason that straight couples do, which is love and commitment. And so you see the shift in the advertising and the tactics in the way people talk about it, where often the campaigns have been wary of putting gay and lesbian couples front and center in their advertising. And they start doing that a lot more, where they actually have people saying, I can't imagine my life without my partner, and showing how much marriage itself is meaningful, the sort of symbolic cultural capital of marriage, apart from what it means legally.
Right. So you mentioned there was some time tension between the national groups and the various state groups that were actually getting the laws passed. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that as it played out in Hawaii.
Yes, so I think that there's a sort of tension from the beginning in Hawaii. The national organizations, and once this moves into the political sphere, right? So the Hawaii Supreme Court rules in May of 1993 in favor of the 6 plaintiffs in the Bear lawsuit, and sends it back to trial court. And that ends up happening. There's a long wait, but it's September of 1996 that it goes to trial. And it's during that period that the legislature gets a hold of this. There are a series of bills touching on marriage, and then eventually you have a constitutional amendment that goes to the ballot in November 1998. And eventually the Human Rights Campaign, which is the big uh, national gay rights political organization, very much focused on advocacy in Washington, on lobbying Congress and the administration. Invest some significant money in 1998 during the campaign season, but there's a period in 1996 where a handful of legislators who voted on the sort of pro-gay marriage side of, or the non-anti-gay marriage side of these proposals, and the legislature come up and they lose in primaries in the summer or late summer, early fall of 1996, and in the general election. And the Human Rights Campaign gives a token contribution to a political action committee to support them. And you know, a lot of that is that they're not built to do local politics. I mean, some of this is like boring procedural things, but you had activists in Hawaii who were calling out for these national organizations to help protect these legislators. Not just, you know, which sort of works on two levels. One, you want to defend your friends, because that's like a, you know, sort of a basic axiom of politics. But the other thing is you don't want to make them an example to other legislators that this is a dangerous vote to take, because if you take it, you'll lose your primary. And you know, the Human Rights Campaign just wasn't built at that point to do local politics. You know, they didn't have a state level committee, but they were also reticent of sort of spending money in local elections where they didn't control the campaigns. And so that's been a source of tension. And some states have sort of more developed gay political advocacy organizations than others. And Hawaii in the mid 90s had, I think a fairly well knit gay and lesbian, LGBT community, but not gay political organizations that knew how to lobby the legislature, for example. And the national organizations were not built to prop those up. And so, what happens in Hawaii is effectively that the legal case gets derailed by the political process. And one of the things we start to see in future states, there's a case that's filed in Vermont in 1997, and then one in Massachusetts in 2001, is that they learn a lot from the Hawaii example, which is that, that eventually politicians will try to, either they'll be forced to, or they will take the initiative to try to sort of commandeer this from the legal arena to the political arena, and that you have to do a lot of groundwork to make sure that legislators, the attorney general, people like that are your audience, as well as, the justices of the Supreme Court or a trial judge or whatever.
Right. Hey, I want to talk a little bit about the book, because it is a massive enterprise and a very thorough book. I wonder if you could tell people a little bit about your research methodology, and were you mostly doing interviews with people, or were you reading news reports, or were you looking at original documents or court documents? What were your sources and how did you make them?
All of the above. So the great thing about this period in time, and the book's narrative basically starts in 1989, 1990 in Honolulu, is that, it's just far enough in the past that people have given their papers to archives and libraries, and you can, as a researcher, get your hands on primary source documents that way, but also recent enough that most of my subjects and sources are still alive and still reachable and willing to sit down with me, and so to some degree it was the most fruitful reporting was like a form of arbitrage, where I could find documents either in archives or libraries or collections, sometimes in people's private papers that they had never sort of, shared publicly before. And then I could go interview people about those documents. And, Dan Foley, Judge Foley, who's going to join us later, we spent a lot of time talking over the course of this. In his case, I reviewed his papers at which are held at a library in UC Berkeley. I think he gave them in 1999 when the Baird litigation was wrapping up. I believe no other researcher had looked at them. And then what I was able to do, though, is load them all onto my iPad. And then when I made my next trip to Hawaii, I was able to sit down with him and say, what did you mean when you wrote this? And often people hadn't, I was finding things in archival collections that people hadn't looked at, forgotten that they had, written, and
Yeah.
I'd be able to say, what did you mean in this memo when you said this? And they would, and I should say I'm a non-lawyer. So I like to joke that I got to play deposition by pulling out these old, you wrote this letter in 1997. What did you mean by it? But that's a real gift, and then I was able to sort of maintain an ongoing source relationship with the people I interviewed. So it was easy for me to go back to them when I found something else or somebody else brought something up in an interview and then bounce it off them.
How much time did you spend interviewing the good guys and how much interviewing the opposition?
So, one thing I wanted to do with this book is to have it be a story of sort of all sides of this struggle. And, it is one of to the extent that much has been written about the subject. It tends not to be written about both sides of it, which is it's sort of a, litigation, electoral politics, legislative fights are like fundamentally adversarial. And there are people who've tried to write about, the marriage fights and write only about, as you say, the good guys. And it's, does not give you a terribly good understanding of the dynamics that are playing out in a given sphere. So I was intent on having this be about, folks who are in favor, folks who are against, folks whose opinions or positions changed over the course of this. And also, there are a lot of really interesting internal fights, even among the good guys, about ideologically, about strategy, tactics, timing, all that stuff.
Really?
Yes. And so, I think some of the most interesting parts of this book are people that you, from the outside, you assume would agree or be moving in lockstep and actually have, a lot of internal conflicts that determine the arc of this thing. The one thing that from, as you asked, Ian, like, who did I interview the most? It was harder to get people who were on the losing side of this to want to talk to me. And there are exceptions, but I think a lot of folks who, there's one example that sort of just stuck with me. There's a guy named Matt Daniels who in 1999 starts an organization called the Alliance for Marriage. It's sort of the first major single issue anti-gay marriage national organization in the United States. He's like a youngish, handsome guy who gets a lot of media attention as he launches this organization. He's the big driver behind what becomes the federal marriage amendment. He's profiled on the front page of USA Today. There are network news segments about him, kind of the more accessible face of the anti-gay marriage campaigns. He's, profiled in the Atlantic. Not a shy guy is, I guess, what I'm trying to communicate to you. And I went trying to, so he was a major figure in the media for like 4 or 5 years when this was a dominant issue in the country. And I went looking for him starting in 2012, 13 when I worked on this book. And his name is Matt Daniels. So it's like sort of hard to Google and like, it's hard to, and I was having trouble figuring out what happened to this guy. And I eventually found somebody who worked at some like international foreign policy think tank in DC. And, found his bio and like, he was clearly the same age, went to the same college, like I think looked the same. And he didn't mention that for, his first major thing was that he was, led this national organization. He's just like, down into the memory hole. Like, I don't want to be associated with that anymore. And there were versions that people haven't like so aggressively disowned their role, but don't want to be spokespeople for this anymore. And I've never really covered sports as a journalist, but I suspect that the losers locker room is a harder place to get interviews than the winners locker room. And by the time I started writing this, there was already a sense, I think by everybody involved, that there was only one way this was going to end. And there was some uncertainty about, when exactly and how it would end. But there was already a sense that among people who had fought very aggressively against, what we now call marriage equality, that they had already lost. And a lot of them were already moving on either to other sort of anti-LGBT issues or just to other political priorities altogether.
Right. Yeah, that poor thing. That's what we say in Hawaii about somebody that has to give up their identity. So a lot of your book takes place in Hawaii, and I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how that came about and what that was like for you. Was it a surprise or something you expected, or how did that all work?
Yeah, so I made my first trip to Hawaii, I think in early 2013, and it was clear to me that the Hawaii lawsuit, the Bear case, was an important early part in the story. I don't think and it's where my book begins. Page one starts in Honolulu with Genora Dancel, who will be joining us, I guess, a little later. I didn't know for sure that the story would begin there. And one of the things there are all sorts of debates in the gay rights community in the 1980s about how to pursue marriage. There are a handful of lawsuits in the early 1970s in state and federal court that effectively don't go anywhere. And sort of figuring out where the story starts was the first challenge. And so what I realized was that the Hawaii case was the place that where we sort of crossed the threshold of the imagination, where people had talked about gay couples marrying in the 70s and 80s, but it was not a real political issue or legal objective in the way we'd think about it. It was, I think of it as sort of, we discuss a lot of abstract things, but they're not like, I don't know, we discuss like cannibalism and like the merits of it, but we don't treat it as like an actual political issue. And Hawaii is the place where this became a real political issue. And that means both that, people started to develop opinions on it that weren't just like legal theorists, where political organizations, legal organizations started to line up on various sides of it, where you had coalition building, organization. And then obviously you see this go to the mainland with the Defense of Marriage Act. And so it became clear to me eventually that the story began in Hawaii, and that I would sort of later fill in some of that prehistory, but that the story of how this began would start there. And the question of how this case got started was a mystery that I had to unravel. It's, we know, and it was well documented in the papers at the time, that on December 17th, 1990, Bill Woods, who was the sort of leading gay activist in Hawaii at the time, led 3 couples into the Honolulu office of the Hawaii Department of Public Health, requested marriage licenses. And they were not granted. The public health director said that he had to check with the attorney general. 10 days later, the attorney general issues a letter that says, no, under state law, marriage is only between a man and a woman. And that the following May, those couples sued the state, alleging that the discrimination violated the Hawaii state constitution. So that's sort of the publicly known history that got written about in the Advertiser and Star Bulletin at the time, and then eventually ends up obviously in the legal records. So, but the question of how those couples end up doing this thing in December of 1990 was never well explained. And there are a lot of people, Bill Woods passed on in, I believe, 2008 or 9. There were versions of this story that were told in national outlets and local outlets through the 1990s. Various people had different interests or incentives in how they sort of framed what happened then and what the agenda was. The fact is that Bill Woods wasn't a lawyer. He did not have a legal strategy. My research suggests he, either misread the sort of state family law code or sort of willfully disregarded what it said, and thought that it was, more likely than it was that these couples might just be married on the spot or given marriage licenses on the spot. But I wanted to unpack what his motives were. What did he want to accomplish? And the backstory that is sort of the opening is that this has its origins not in, as many other great social movements do, in this far-sighted vision of legal change and a strategy that's plotted out, but that he ended up in, what was basically a petty squabble, rivalry for control of the Honolulu Pride Week Planning Committee. And, Bill Woods was a remarkable figure. I think like many sort of first generation activists, he was incredibly entrepreneurial, incredibly courageous in many ways, built a lot of organizations, was very good at getting attention, not particularly good at playing well with others, and ended up in a situation where there were a pair of women with whom he already had a combative relationship who ran this Pride Week committee. He wanted to start a parade. They would not really give him the parade planning subcommittee he wanted. I mean, this is literally every petty event planning thing you've ever been on that ends at the Supreme Court 25 years later. And he ends up deciding he wants to marry couples as a way of basically overshadowing the vigil and picnic that this other group is doing. And then ends up in he hopes that the ACLU will back him if this becomes a legal issue. And the ACLU wants nothing to do with him, basically, the state affiliate of the ACLU. And so I sort of document how over the course of 1990, Woods goes from starting on this marriage thing as sort of this internal play within this Pride Week planning committee to then it becoming a conflict between him and the ACLU, which doesn't want to tell him that they will back him, but doesn't want to tell him no because they don't want to antagonize him. And their board members have all sorts of different history with him. And he and the event that, has been well documented in December of 1990 is Woods trying to force the hand of the ACLU by having what is basically a PR stunt. And so he takes the couples into they request the marriage licenses. They go back to the ACLU. He hopes that that's going to sort of shame the ACLU, that having cameras in their face will shame them into saying that they'll back the couples. They still don't. And then this case gets handed to Dan Foley the next month because Woods is sort of out of tricks at this point. And now they do have a live legal claim that they could make. And Dan Foley launches the suit, which, by his own admission was an absolute long shot at that point. And so, these are messy origins of what ends up being a grand American story. And I didn't know going in that I was going to spend so much time reconstructing, a pride parade's planning committee's internal deliberations. But, I think that there's that messiness is inconvenient at a lot of times to people who want to write history for a variety of reasons. And I thought it was important to show how this wasn't inevitable. This, despite the sort of justice of the outcome, this was not inevitable. It was not planned. It was not strategized. None of the traditional sort of infrastructure of the gay rights movement had defined this as a priority, let alone initiated this. And we, as reminded me a little bit of some of the histories of like the beginnings of World War I that we read, which are that, we sort of stumbled into this and nobody really had a clear sense of what everybody else was doing and what the implications of it would be or where it would lead. And so that's, the first big chunk of the book is in Hawaii, and it's sort of, a story of like the invention of an issue, how these accidental origins create something that now the rest of the country has to figure out how to kind of integrate into its politics.
So now that you've delved into what happened in the different states and the national organizations, it begs the question, if it hadn't happened in Hawaii, would marriage have become the issue that it did? Or how long would it take them?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great counterfactual. I think at some point there probably would have been a time where you had an active push for marriage rights, but there was not a clear consensus in 1990 among gay rights organizations that this was a desirable outcome. Nobody thought it was a winnable outcome anytime soon, and most people thought it was the longest long shot of the things that the gays and lesbians could be asking for. But there was an active debate that I sort of chronicle here that played out, mostly among sort of lawyers and legal theorists through the 1980s about whether fighting for marriage equality, nobody called it that then, but fighting for marriage rights was even desirable. And it split down like largely on gender lines. You had the sort of, to the extent that there was gay and lesbian family law in the 1980s, it was almost entirely dominated by female lawyers representing female clients who were largely women who had been in heterosexual marriages, had biological children of their own, left their marriages, came out of the closet, left their marriages, and had trouble getting access to their own biological children in courts. And that's what gay and lesbian family law was. It was focused on basically getting access to kids. And a lot of those lawyers had been shaped by sort of second wave feminism. They'd gone to school and law school in the 70s. And they viewed marriage suspiciously. They saw it as a patriarchal, heteronormative institution. There was still, a strong liberationist impulse in the gay rights community that sort of, argued that the goal of the gays and lesbians have created their own sort of sexual values and mores, and the goal should be to fight for, some people talk about multiple families, that the legal goal should be a legal structure that recognize a variety, a spectrum of marriage types equally. And that could be two people of either gender in any combination living together, but also three people living together, or single parents, or co-parents adopting a child, and, people living in communes, whatever, but that the goal of gays and lesbians family law should be to not to perpetuate traditionally heterosexual institutions like marriage. And so, there was not a consensus on this, which is why, there was not a single gay rights organization in the United States that had endorsed marriage as an objective in 1990. And so I think it's entirely possible that we would have gone a long while before there was ever a case launched on strong footing to challenge marriage laws, because what would have played out in states was a sort of more diffuse push for different types of family recognition. I mean, clearly what you started to have domestic partnerships that were being recognized in various ways. And I think the more natural arc would have been a more incrementalist strategy where different communities sort of sought different types of family structures depending on who the activists were in those places. And it's really only a sort of freakish set of occurrences that takes place at the Hawaii Supreme Court in the summer of 1992 that makes it a court that could be in any way responsive to a marriage case.
Right. So looking back at the strategies that were used by both sides during this fight, which obviously evolved over time, I wonder if you can talk at all about what are the lessons learned for the ongoing fights? As you mentioned, now the issue of marriage doesn't seem to be contentious anymore. It certainly is not a political talking point for anyone. It does seem that the right has picked up new issues, mostly around gender. There's a suspicion that they have carefully researched which topics to focus on, as shown by the fact that our own representative to the United States Congress, Tulsi Gabbard, came out suddenly against trans girls being able to compete in sports. And of course, this is a great issue because it's about fairness to girls, and it's not fair for teenage girls that they have to compete against, et cetera, et cetera. So what do we learn from the marriage debate that's going to carry over to the present day?
Yeah, I mean, so, one of the things I think that's important about the marriage debate that helps explain why it ultimately became so easy to win in a way that the sort of trans debate, as you introduced it, doesn't seem this way, is that unlike a lot of other social movements in the United States, civil rights movements, there wasn't a sort of scarce resource at stake. I think about the analogy to the suffrage movement, to to racial desegregation movements, and at every point there was, you know, in the late 19th century, when the first movement for women's property rights was afoot, husbands and fathers had a reasonable expectation that their wealth would be taken away if women were able to own property. They, you know, white men saw the threat that their political power would be diluted if women and African Americans could vote. You know, all the desegregation, school desegregation movement, people saw neighborhood institutions in which they were invested threatened to change. You know, affirmative action has its own, you know, obviously competition for places in educational institutions and such. What happened with the marriage debate, you know, and one of the questions about the marriage debate, I think, is how it went from looking sort of so fierce and intractable as a conflict to looking so fast and easy in a matter of time. And to the point now where people think that, you know, you can learn lessons about how to make other social change easy off of it. And I think some of that was that there was never, you know, the counterfactual that's interesting here is, what if, you know, the state of Hawaii had only 10,000 marriage licenses to give out in a year? How would the coalition of straight people who supported marriage equality, you know, the bill in 2013, the one before the legislature, look different if they thought that they'd have to wait in line, or their kids would have to wait in line for a marriage certificate because they'd already been given out to lesbians that year? I suspect that the politics of it would have been very different. And so what you see is a shift around, I think, really, you know, that comes around 2004 when Massachusetts starts to legalize marriage, where the debate has, you know, initially it's a debate about public meaning. It's about what's the definition of marriage. Will the state stick to the sort of traditional definition of opposite sex marriage, or expand this institution to include new people? And the debate over public meaning seems incredibly fraught. But once you get past the hurdle of having changed the public meaning in Massachusetts, what you start to realize with time is that there are not a lot of people invested in there are not a lot of people who could sort of claim injury or are invested in fighting same-sex marriage once they've stopped holding the line on the public meaning debate. And I think part of the story is not just that the expansion of people in favor of same-sex marriage, it's the shrinking of the opposition, because no matter how sort of reflexively anti-gay folks are, they don't have to give up anything when gay couples want to get married in their state. And I think that what makes, you know, there are kind of trans debates that are effectively about public meaning, I think, like things like, you know, should health insurance have to cover, you know, various things related to gender assignment, or for example, should there be bans on conversion therapy, things like that. But I think the appeal of the debates over these sort of single gender spaces, whether it's women's only sports, you know, single sex schools, bathrooms, is that you ground active. And I'm not sure there's a lesson in that, but I think it's worth recognizing what are we really fighting over? Are we really? And I do think that there's a way in which it'll be easier for trans opponents to hold together a coalition of people who are invested in keeping, you know, girls softball teams intact than it will be people who want to fight to keep conversion therapy, you know, legal. And so I think that, I think interrogating what exactly is keeping, you know, not just people opposed to it, but people invested in the fight. I think there was a point at which you had people who were opposed to same-sex marriage, but they stopped activism, donations, like they stopped pushing, and you just got this huge imbalance around 2012 between the kind of both financing and volunteer capacity of the movements. And I think that's an important part of the story that, the other thing I should just say, that you probably have thoughts on, Dean, is, you know, as you mentioned, the marriage debate played out on the foundation of shifting not just scientific research, but kind of a broad cultural understanding of where sexual orientation came from over this period. And it seems like we're, still fairly early in the cycle of a broad public understanding of what gender identity is, what it means to be trans. And I suspect that, the political debate will have to sort of exist on the foundation of how our cultural understanding of these issues changes with sort of new scientific understanding.
Yeah, it is still early days. And just as there were hardly any gays in 1970, and all of a sudden there's a lot, that's even been more dramatic in the case of gender, because even when I was growing up and doing research on sexual orientation, I was still like, oh, that's 1 out of 10,000. And now it's a lot higher.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. I will say I'm not sure about the resource question, because it almost seems like the right wing picked trans girls in sports because no one had an example. Like most of the laws are built around a complete theoretical that no one's seen. So it's almost like, let's just do it about something that sounds really scary and nobody can actually disprove. But you did mention the obvious gigantic elephant in the room, which is the role of organized religion. And I wonder if you could just talk about that a little bit, like from a national level, and also how that might apply or not apply to our Hawaii.
Yeah. So, the second section of my book starts in Salt Lake City. The first section of the book is set in Hawaii and sort of follows what I sort of started with Bill Woods up until the Supreme Court decision in May of '93. And the second section of it starts in Salt Lake City inside the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and how the Mormon leadership, starting in 1994, really became the first mainland institution of any kind, not just a religious denomination, but political organization, anything, to really understand the what had happened at the Hawaii Supreme Court and the potential consequences, both there and in the rest of the country. I mean, it is as a journalist, going back and reading some of the press coverage is remarkable to see how long it takes people on the mainland to see this sort of landmark state Supreme Court decision for what it is. I mean, years, really. And I suspect if the same decision had come down in any other state besides Alaska, it would have sort of gotten sized up far more quickly by sort of major mainland institutions. And it's the Mormons who have, a sort of longstanding footprint in Hawaii that they through historical connections and property ownership and a sort of disproportionate amount of political influence as landholders, that take an interest in this. And so I sort of reconstruct how the LDS Church tries to get involved in the Bear lawsuit, how then they are the ones who are leading the push to try to lobby legislators by creating Hawaii's Future Today, which is effectively a front group by their own admission that they partner with the Archdiocese of Honolulu to lobby the legislature, and they pretend that they are focused on anti-prostitution, anti-gambling, and anti-same-sex marriage, when there is at the time no active anything around prostitution or gambling. And what it shows is a dynamic that sort of plays out over time, which is that the Mormons, in a way that other religious denominations in the United States, I mean, they're obviously highly centralized, but they are incredibly savvy about playing local politics, and they have tremendous resources. They are very aware of how they are perceived by non-Mormons going back to the mid-19th century, and they have a desire to try to influence policy, but have no need or ambition to be the face of movements. And so the partnership with the Catholic Church ends up being, to some degree, that the Mormons are the drivers in funding the major resources. They're paying for the polling. They're sending senior members of Dick Worthland, who was Ronald Reagan's pollster and becomes an elder in the Mormon Church, gets basically detailed to work on this Hawaii campaign, for example. But that the church is far more willing to be the sort of public face of this and partnership. And you see how they come into this in part because they saw Mike Gabbard, Tulsi's father, who had been the leading anti-gay activist in Hawaii, as totally unsuited for running an actual serious lobbying effort focused on the legislature, not to mention a statewide campaign, that they're willing to come in and spend a lot of money to do it. And the reason that you see the first statewide bans on same-sex marriage emerge in Western states, Utah's the first in 1994, then you start to see Idaho, California, constitutional amendment in Nevada the next year. Those are states with large LDS populations. And what happens though with the Mormons is that, I think two things sort of, they drift out of the marriage fight, for the better part of a decade, from the late 90s to 2008. And two things happen. When the Salt Lake City Olympics is coming, they sort of see this as their international coming out, the moment that they can sort of take this very traditional American religion and use mass media around the world to sort of validate it. And then Mitt Romney running for president in 2008. And it leads the church to be hyper cautious about political activity. And it's during that period when evangelical and fundamentalist Protestants, including some of the big names, the Jerry Falwells and Jim Dobson types, come in and get very involved with trying to push for a federal marriage amendment. And it is, and they are incredibly loud. They are actually not always that good at playing politics because they very much enjoy their, tax-free ministry status and can't actually do a lot of aggressive on-the-ground politicking as nonprofits. And it's in California in 2008 where the Mormons returned to the fray in partnership with the Catholic Church to pass Prop 8. And by then, the Catholic Church is a totally diminished force in various parts of the country because of the consequence of the various child abuse molestation scandals. And you start to see that in Massachusetts in 2003-4, where they are trying to lobby the legislature to pass a constitutional amendment. And already, in Massachusetts, of all places, where the Catholic Church had tremendous sway over politicians, they do not command the same respect. In other parts of the country, they're in the process of selling assets when these big statewide campaigns come up because they have settlements and class action lawsuits with people who are alleging abuse. And so the Catholic Church just ends up not ever really regaining its resources to play in politics, or the ability to sort of be a source of moral suasion, or certainly around issues of like sexual purity or anything like that. And you get this kind of fragmenting of the religious coalition, and eventually the Mormons feel so burned by being seen as sort of scapegoated by in mass media and popular culture for Proposition 8, which gets sort of disproportionate attention because it's California, that they basically step back from anti-gay politics entirely within a year or two after that.
Well, we're beginning to run out of time. Back in the old days when book events like this were held at bookstores, often the author would read a passage. I should have asked you whether you would like to read a passage, or we could.
I don't have one in front of me. I
right.
prepared better if I know.
Let me ask you what you are hoping for with this book. And this has been a big chunk of your life, and it's going to come out shortly. What are you hoping for?
So I guess a few things. One is I hope it's a sort of enduring record of sort of this major social, political, legal shift that's you know, I came to books about the civil rights movement 20 years after they happened, and you know, on a big topic like that, you expect new things will be written and new things will be uncovered. And I look forward to reading the next books that come along. But I hope that this is sort of the first thing that puts it all together nationally, and that it has a sort of remains a sort of durable document of this sort of defining period. I hope in places, you know, I was really excited to do an event in Hawaii. My book doesn't come out for another week, and in the pre-COVID days, I had a fantasy that I would begin, you know, a book tour in Hawaii, because the book starts in Hawaii, and you know, as I sort of suggested, I don't think that mainland folks ever gave the events in Hawaii their proper due. But I think there are a number of places around the states, localities that get sort of undue attention in my narrative because of what happened there. Utah is another good example, and I think that in a lot of those places, as I think is the case in Hawaii, people have a keen sense of, have their own memories of what, folks who were alive in the 90s in Hawaii, and at least in any way alert to politics, remember obviously this marriage fight. But they don't always have a good sense of how that fit into the broader national story. And so, there are people in Vermont who remember the civil unions fight, but they don't entirely understand. They probably have no idea how it was sort of built on both the successes and the failures of what happened in Hawaii, for example. And so, what I hope is that, if you've lived, if you're over the age of 18, you have some vivid memory of some part of this, and probably don't fully understand the entire context in which the things you remember took place. And so, I hope that people read this and they sort of alternate between pages where they're taken into a world that's entirely new to them, and then they see something that's, familiar. It's like, oh yeah, I remember when Gavin Newsom started marrying gay couples in San Francisco, but I didn't realize entirely what was motivating him to do it and what the fallout was and where that led, and that that ends up giving folks a sort of richer understanding of what they've lived through.
Well, thank you so much, Sasha. I think
Thanks,
is going to be.
I really appreciate this.
Yeah, it's going to be an important book, and I'm sure it will be on bookshelves everywhere. And I think it has been such a wide, diverse type of movement, and such an unexpected one in ways that it's really wonderful to have it down in the book. And I think that's just fantastic. And I hope you will be able to come to Hawaii in person.
I can't wait, for a variety of reasons. Yes. Looking forward to seeing you all in person.
And join us here. All right. I think we're going to move on now to the panel with several of our distinguished colleagues from Hawaii. So if folks could come on in and join us. And I see, first of all, Genora Dancel, who is the reason this all started in some ways, which is fantastic.
I'll take the blame.
We have Judge Daniel Foley, who's the reason in part why things came out the way that they did, and plays a very major role in the book. We have from the legislative side, now Speaker of the House, Scott Saiki, who was in right at the very beginning, as we heard from Sasha, as the legislators began to mess around with the courts to a certain degree. And we have a baby with us, Chris Lee, who was quite young at the time this all began, but was very important as it eventually played out more recently in more recent years. So wonderful to have you all here. And I'm going to start with a question to Genora. And I know you've probably answered this many times, but I still want to ask it. So you are fairly recently in a relationship. You're wildly in love, of course. You've already moved in together. Whatever made you think it would be a good idea to get married? Because you didn't hear it from anybody else. Why did you think you should get married?
And I think that's the reason why Sasha had decided to start the book on me on chapter 1, because it really is a human story behind all of this. And everything that happened after that, legally, historically, religiously, it was just a reaction to what people actually started. So I'm gonna try to like package your big question into an explanation why I wanted to get married. I always felt that this was my destiny. And when I met Dan Foley, of course we had to go through Bill Woods and show up at the Department of Health. But these are all the things that you have to do in order to get to your ultimate destination. And so when I met Dan Foley, and as we all know, Sasha has written in his book that after our first court case, we left Bill Woods and we began to work with Dan more one-on-one. And we had basically the same conviction. And he was a man who was passionate about what he did and what he said and what he believed in. And we were all meshed into one, if you can imagine that. And so it wasn't hard to take it from that year on and go out and in public and actually do this court case. As a plaintiff, there's a lot of things I can talk about, but it's really hard to imagine coming from my point of view as a plaintiff. It's really it's a really profound experience, I find. And we just took this opportunity and we basically put all of our belief in Dan, because when we had this one-on-one meetings with him, everything was apparent. And so how could we go wrong? We had the same dream. And so we had to have this openness, and we had to live our truth. And it all began when, as a child, I always wanted equality, and I always fought for equality everywhere I went. And I knew I was gay since I was 5. It's my life story. And I met someone I totally fell in love with. And for some reason, I wanted to get married. And so into the relationship 3 months later, I like the way Sasha wrote about this. Like, I was in the hotel room in California somewhere in San Jose, and I was holding a ring that I had bought, and I was on the phone with Nania at the time. And I just asked her because I thought that was part of, my destiny. And it felt so right. And so 3 months later, we just met in June of '90. And 3 months after that, I asked her to marry me, and she said yes. And so we were trying to figure out how we're gonna accomplish this. And we had things that happened to us, like Nania had an earache, and we took her to the hospital emergency room, and I had 2 health plans at the time, and I couldn't put her on either one. So because of what happened, we realized that this is something we need to work towards, and how can we bring all of this together? So when December happened and Nania was already talking to Bill Woods, she called up and the Gay Community Center and asked Bill, how can we get rights for medical? And so it all began there. And so he basically introduced the thought of going down to the Department of Health on December 17th. And so there's variations of answers that I can give you what made me do this. And it was just a natural process, actually. And it was part of, believing in what you were here to do and just going through all of that, despite the feedbacks and everything that it's a big story actually, and it's all layered into a human.
Yeah.
And so I happen to be that human.
You are indeed, and we're all very grateful for that. So then let me ask you this, Daniel. These people come to you and they have this idea of getting married. And we read in the book how you are chanting and thinking about it and everything. But I'm very curious. You must have gone through in your mind pros and cons and pros from a personal level as a lawyer. And I'm just wondering, what were those pros and cons, and what finally tipped the scale for you?
Not really. You know, I was a civil rights lawyer, and they came to me and they needed representation, and I could see they couldn't find it, and I felt they deserved their day in court. I'd also worked with the gay community in Honolulu on HIV/AIDS, the Miss Gay Molokai pageant. I was working with Bill Woods at the time and getting a bill through the legislature to have no employment discrimination based on sexual orientation, housing, and public accommodations. I knew there had never been a gay rights case before the Hawaii Supreme Court, not one. I was teaching civil rights litigation at the time. Speaker Saiki was in my class, in fact. And so I basically looked at it like, okay, if the state's going to deny them a marriage license, what reason do they have? And I think one of the things I did, and I did it with my class up at the law school, and this is before search engines and Google and all of that, was to find out, and Sasha mentioned this in your talk, what rights and benefits, what legal rights and benefits come with a marriage license. And we went through the entire Hawaii revised statute page by page, because their index were useless, and found over 400 rights. So the argument was, you withhold the marriage license, you withhold over 400 rights and benefits to this class of people. What's your reason? The state has to give a reason. And then the next step would be is, how would a court review this case? And if you're race discrimination, they have to show a compelling state interest. Gender discrimination within Hawaii state constitution, compelling state interest. Most things are just a rational basis, which courts defer to the legislature. So I had to think of a way to make it analogous to race discrimination, gender discrimination, or the right to privacy, which we had in our state constitution. So it was really just working through this legal process, how to put together a case. I had made up my mind, having met them, they deserved their day in court. As Sasha mentioned, I told him I wasn't as confident as Genora at the time, or Bill Woods for that matter. But I was confident. We have a more liberal Supreme Court, a more expansive state Bill of Rights. I knew it had to be in state court, not federal court, that we'd get something. You know, we could get the court to acknowledge some status of LGBT people. The state has to give a good reason. So that's how I went into it. And then we can get to it later, but as Sasha mentioned, it wasn't until October of '92 when I was arguing the case before the Hawaii Supreme Court, and he goes into this in the book, that it finally dawned on me that we could win this case.
So speaking about that, sometime when I've read other magazine articles or commentaries about marriage and they talk about Hawaii, they say, well, of course it happened in Hawaii first because they're very diverse, they're very multicultural, they have a tradition of same-sex relations. And I wonder if you could just speculate a little bit about how much that played a role as compared to the randomness of who sits on the Supreme Court at any one particular time, in particular in 1993. What was the reasons?
Okay, I gave that some thought and I was dead wrong with my conclusion. I thought Hawaii would be more tolerant. As you mentioned, and you know very well, there's a tradition in Polynesian culture, Mahu, and recognizing LGBT people. The prejudice has been brought to the islands by outside religious institutions. We adopted gender discrimination prohibition in our 1950 Constitution. We have a broader equal protection. We have multiracial, multi-religious. I thought the state would be more open. And I was really taken aback after the May 5, 1993 decision with the reaction of the general public and the legislature and community leaders, how vicious and hostile and angry people were initially. I didn't see that coming. So I have to admit, Dean, I assumed it was more tolerant and more open, but that didn't prove to be the case on this issue at that time. It changed rather quickly, and Chris Lee can get into that. He was there when the change was happening in a good way. He can explain it, but when I was doing it in the 90s, it didn't seem too tolerant to me.
Well, that brings in the question then of how this was received by the public and by the legislature. And Scott, since you're our senior legislator, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about when this issue first entered your consciousness and what the process was like.
Sure, Dean. So I guess I kind of have this distinction of having served in the legislature throughout almost the entire time frame in which same-sex marriage was working its way through the process. And I remember when I was in 1997, when I was in the House, that was the year that the legislature approved the constitutional amendment. And as you know, it went on to the ballot in the general election of 1998. But I have to say that I think, the legislature probably reflected the general public in that, members, at least in the House, there were a lot of senior members. There were a lot of it was a generational issue. There were a lot of older members. There were Asian members. I think at that time the Asian community was larger than it is today. And the thing is with Asian seniors, seniors form opinions. They may not tell you what their opinion is, but they form very specific opinions. And I think they formed an opinion on same-sex marriage, which is why the amendment was ratified by 70% of the voters in 1998. And just to give you an example, when I was in 1999, I was the vice chair of the House Judiciary Committee, and one of the bills that we had tried to move was a bill that would ban housing discrimination based on sexual orientation. So at that time, in 1998, there was no prohibition on that. So we tried to move the legislation. We couldn't get it through the House. The majority of the House told us they were going to vote no. So we had to hold back on that.
Even then, yeah. And Chris, you come in a little bit later. Tell us a little bit about how the political climate had changed or what the calculations were in 2013.
Well, in 1999, I was graduating from high school. So,
Okay.
but I say that kiddingly. I think, it was still probably not as divisive an issue as it once was at that point, but it was still very politically dangerous. And I think because of that, people were very scared. I remember there was a year when it must have been like 2010 or 2011 when civil unions was yet to be passed or about to be passed. And Blake Oshiro was then, I think, the majority leader in the House, walked into the office. And I was sitting there with a couple of other friends, representatives from other districts. And he had a couple bills to sign. One was a civil unions bill, and one underneath it was a same-sex marriage bill. And I didn't think anything of it, so I signed both. And as they were getting passed around, people were reading them and signing them. I remember somebody made a comment like, "You sure you want to sign that?" And there's still, I think, a hesitation politically that kept this issue really, out of the public eye, or certainly out of the major discussions in the legislature for a long time. And it took folks like Blake and Scott and others who were in those elected positions to start to have those discussions in a real way. I think to start to change the internal dynamic within the legislature here, so that it's not an issue that's very scary, but rather something that becomes about rights and aloha for all and all the other things that, you know, this is about. And I think it's so easy to look back, but in 2013, I mean, even I credit Scott, I mean, because it really was Scott, I think more than anyone, at least that I could see, who did the due diligence behind the scenes, and Blake and others too, for trying to set up a same-sex marriage special session, because you had to get the governor on board, and it's a whole complicated process politically and legally to orchestrate that kind of thing. So I didn't expect it, and so I think once that was in motion, we could then sort of like step back and assess, like, all right, now how do we actually pass this thing, and how do we get the public on board and message and all that. But yeah, it was definitely not the political and public dynamic that we have today.
Some people blame Governor Abercrombie's lack of a second term on this particular issue, and I wonder if any of you could comment on that, if that's a reasonable assessment or.
And there's a point, I think, where those who've been paying attention totally remember there was a town hall, I think, in Pearl City, where Governor Abercrombie was, and he was answering questions of the crowd, and there happened to be a reporter there, and a woman had come up to him, and he's standing on the stage looking down at her, and she's asking him some question, and he basically gave an answer that's something to the effect of, you know, listen, I'm not your friend, I'm not your pal, I'm the governor, and this is the way it's going to be. And that made the news, and I think it was more that kind of repeated gaffe. I don't know, Scott, you want to?
I agree with Chris. I think Governor Abercrombie lost for other reasons. He did not lose because of the marriage issue. In fact, in 2014, right the year after we approved same-sex marriage,
right,
several of our House incumbents were targeted by the churches, by the Republican Party, and even by some of our evangelical House members. And they were targeted big time, and including some of the freshman members who had all voted yes, who had voted in favor of same-sex marriage. But you know, none of them lost the election. None of them lost, and in fact, some of them just routed their opponents. So I don't think the governor lost because of that issue.
Good. I'm glad that you cleared that up, because we often hear that, and I've always kind of doubted it myself. So back to the beginning of all of this, Dan, you've gone to the Supreme Court. You've obviously made what seems like a really good argument, because they're listening to you and asking the right questions. Why does it take so long until, and Genora is just ready to, you know, she's ready to slip the ring on and get the certificate and all of that stuff. Why does it now take so long for this to play out in the court?
Well, the Supreme Court in May, with an opinion written by Justice Levinson, sent it back to the lower court for a trial, with a burden on the state to show a compelling state interest. We thought at that time we would win at the trial level, come back to the state Supreme Court and have marriage. We felt fairly confident. But then the legislature responded and started holding public hearings, and on the House side, initiating a constitutional amendment. So we had to respond to that in the 94 session. And one of the things we did working with the Senate side was to get them to create a commission on sexual orientation and the law to study the matter, because I didn't want the legislature to do anything. And so a good way to get them to do nothing is create a commission to study the matter. And fortunately, the way the commission was put together, chaired by Tom Gill, they were supposed to report back to the legislature with a recommendation within a year. I felt if they came in favor of same-sex marriage, I could use that in court as a document. There wasn't a lot of stuff, but it ended up in federal court because the legislature had reserved seats for the Mormons and Catholics on the commission. You can't do that. Federal court said you can't do that. So it took 2 years before the commission submitted its report to the legislature. So we're already in the 96th session. And Judge Chang, Kevin Chang, who was the trial court judge, the state attorney general was asking for delay to put their case together. And Judge Chang was interested to see what the commission was going to do.
Oh.
So the case kind of just sat there for at least those 2 years, and then went to trial in '96. We got the decision, a big victory in December of '96 from Kevin Chang. And we were very confident that it would be affirmed by the Hawaii Supreme Court. The Attorney General at the time, Marjorie Bronster, brought in Charles Cooper, a top DC conservative lawyer who ended up representing the Prop 8 people later in California. He didn't even argue Judge Chang was wrong. He argued the Hawaii Supreme Court was wrong in May of '93. But since the legislature responded to Judge Chang's decision in the '97 session with a proposed constitutional amendment, to our disappointment, the appeal just sat there. We tried to get the appeal expedited. Our motion was denied. We tried to get the stay imposed by Judge Chang on his own opinion vacated so the marriages could begin. But the Supreme Court did nothing. It just sat there and let the constitutional amendment go to the ballot in '98. It was overwhelmingly approved, and the case was dismissed in '99. So that's the time frame. That's the delay.
Sasha, you had a chance to compare Hawaii to many other states, and I'm wondering what you think about the progress here and the delays here, just, you know, in Hawaii compared to other states. How would you summarize that?
Yeah, I mean, I think Representative Lee sort of got at some of this implicitly. I think that the experience was so traumatic for Hawaii as a whole, and especially legislators, that it really delayed into 2011, 12, 13, the willingness of people to take this up. And I saw something similar in Vermont, which also had an incredibly, also, you know, what you'd sort of think of as whatever the New England version of Aloha is, not a place with a particularly contentious politics, but they spent, the end of 1999 and 2000 in this really fraught debate over what became civil unions in response to a court decision. Governor Howard Dean was the governor at the time. He campaigned for re-election wearing a bulletproof vest because there were like sort of serious threats of violence at that point. There was a push for a constitutional amendment by opponents of same-sex marriage. And something very similar happened, which is it took another decade. It wasn't until 2009 that Vermont legislators voted for same-sex marriage, because I just think that there was this almost PTSD about anything related to this issue, and nobody wanted to go near it. And in many respects, people might have overlearned the intensity of these fights in 1998 in Hawaii or 2000 in Vermont. And it just sort of, politicians are by nature sort of risk-averse risk-averse figures, and they tend to, often on difficult issues follow public opinion rather than lead it. And I think that there was a sort of reading of what the market would bear on this that in Hawaii and Vermont in particular was a lagging indicator of where public opinion probably actually was at the time.
Dean, can I add to that a little bit?
Yeah, please.
So there's also a political dynamic here, because in the House, between the years 2005 up through 2012, up to the election of 2013, there was a House leadership team in place. I was not a part of the House leadership team at that time. I was a dissident member. So was Chris. He was a dissident member at that time. But this House leadership team was basically guided by the evangelical members of the House Democratic Caucus. And so this leadership team would not allow any kind of votes on marriage or even civil unions, pro-choice issues, the whole gamut of civil rights issues. So it was really a political dynamic. In 2013, our dissident group took over the House. We reorganized the House. We elected a new speaker, who was Joe Suki from Maui, and I became the House Majority Leader. And that was the year 2013 that coincided with the decision coming down from the U.S. Supreme Court, the Windsor case, the DOMA case, which segued us to the special session on marriage.
Well, bring up the really good point of the role of religion in Hawaii. And I wonder if all of you could maybe just talk a little bit about how you see their roles at various points. I think it's, to me, always especially interesting because Hawaii has a religious history that's different than any place else in the United States, a much larger Asian and Buddhist influence. But we also have many things that we share with the United States, including the Church of Latter-day Saints and the Catholic Church, and now a lot of fundamentalists. So how did that affect things for you? We can start out with whoever would like to go.
Well, I'll just, in a very narrow way, I think you had mentioned it, or Sasha, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints moved to intervene in the case because they said they had an interest, because they didn't recognize same-sex marriages, didn't want to perform same-sex marriages. And it went up to the Hawaii Supreme Court in a published opinion written by Justice Paula Nakayama, which said, you don't have to perform same-sex marriages.
Right.
You don't have to recognize same-sex marriages. It doesn't directly impact your church. And we had argued that they didn't have to. You know, they had no interest in the case because they were not going to be forced to do anything. Unfortunately, and this was my frustration with the churches, despite that opinion saying because of the First Amendment Establishment Clause, you don't have to perform same-sex marriages or recognize them, they still went on their campaign to say, we will be forced to do what our Hawaii Supreme Court actually said no. The other argument churches made, is more particular the evangelicals, but you know, that gay marriage was a slippery slope to prostitution, bestiality, and incest, all morally reprehensible. But Justice Levinson had put in his May 5, 1993 decision in a footnote, it would have no impact on those prohibitions. So, you know, but they still argued it would, even though we had case law saying to the contrary. Then the churches argued it would be bad for children. But we had findings of fact after a 2-week trial of experts by Judge Chang that the state didn't even appeal, that the only impact on children would be positive. The children of same-sex couples would have the same rights and benefits as the children of heterosexual married couples, and that same-sex couples were as good in raising children as heterosexual couples, but the church argued to the contrary. So that was my frustration, listening to these arguments and being effective in court, but being entirely ineffective in the court of public opinion in changing things.
Gotcha. Genora, I don't know if you're a religious person or not, but how did you see the role of religion playing out?
Well, I know that the 700 Club came here shortly after our decision. You know, I'm not a really religious person, but I know that was part of the fight. And I always go back to where I always believed that we were going to win. And that was just between me and whoever the powers may be. And I was very hopeful, and a lot of it had turned into a circus, and I would hear all kinds of arguments, and but I was on a daily basis, I was dealing with, you know, discrimination, all kinds of other things. So I couldn't like really focus on this fight. So I didn't want to like spread myself thin, and but I just wanted to live a good life, and I did, and just keep my focus on the ultimate prize, which was that. And so, you know, people are going to argue about it whichever way they want to. And religion is like one of the big institutions that will go on and on about it. And I just decided I just was going to cut that off already. I was just not going to pay any attention to them and focus my energy on, you know, having it being the lawsuits that are being won and all the way up to the US Supreme Court. So I was thinking in long term. So all of this fight was just, to me, a little bit nonsense and, not necessary for me to really get involved with.
I think talking with one of my predecessors, Jackie Young, who was a huge vocal voice on this issue back in the day, and who lost one of her races when she was running for the state senate, largely on this issue, as I understand it. I had assumed that those same churches in that area, in the district that I eventually would come to represent, the Mormon Church, and there are a few others, would be as strong and as vocal on this as they were, 10, 15 years earlier. And so when I kind of got involved in this, when Scott and the others connected me, and Lois Perrin, actually from the ACLU, sat down at lunch and asked, I think they were looking for a very specific kind of face to try and sell the issue publicly in some way, to be on the news and all that. And I'd assumed if I'd sort of started to assume some of those news stories and whatnot, that I'd be targeted and would lose in the same way. But come to find out, after all this, I think Scott mentioned this, nobody lost. After going through the whole thing, being targeted by churches and particularly on a religious foundation, that this is, the end of the world and so forth. I had a Mormon opponent the next election who spent a ton of money and did a lot of, he's a great guy, really nice guy, does a lot of community work and everything else. But the issue just didn't resonate anymore. And this gets back to the earlier question, I think, because particularly for not only a super young generation, which is the obvious, teens and people in their 20s at the time, but even folks in their 30s and 40s and older, for whom it just, they weren't very vocal. They weren't as prominently recognized as a demographic 15 years or 20 years earlier. And I think there were assumptions made about where they were at this time in 2010, 2013, and it just didn't pan out. And so because of that, there really was, I think, definitely a religious overtone and face put on a lot of the opposition, which did not resonate with the public in the same way.
Yeah, Dean, when we were looking for, as Chris mentioned, when we're looking for a face for same-sex marriage, we needed a scraggly look. So that's why we asked Chris to do that. So fortunately, he accepted. But yeah, so unfortunately, in 2013, when we had our special session, that was kind of at the time when the New Hope Church, when the evangelicals had really built up churches throughout the state. And so, basically, the New Hope Church combined with the Mormon Church just were able to dominate the marriage issue. There were some churches that formed a coalition in support of marriage, such as the United Church of Christ. Right. But these are smaller churches, and they just didn't have the same numbers. So when we held our session in October and held public hearings in the House, the Mormons and the New Hope bussed in people to the Capitol to testify at the hearings. And these were unprecedented hearings. It went on for about 4 or 5 days, over 12 hours a day. Thousands and thousands of people were being bussed in to the Capitol. And it got to the point where, I actually called the head of the Mormon church here, and I called the head of the New Hope Church here. And I told them, we understand your position on marriage, but we have the votes and we're going to move this bill out. So you can either voluntarily stop busing people in, or we're just going to shut down the hearings. And they continued to bus people in. So we shut down the hearings a day later and took the bill to a floor vote.
I found this while you were, while Sasha was giving his comments earlier, but this was the room we were stuck in for like 50 something hours for like 5 days. I think we were all seated on the right over here.
I remember it very well, and I had a great fight with Bob McDermott at that exact hearing. So it was quite an eye opener, though. Absolutely.
It was unprecedented.
Yeah.
It also was the last legislative fight in the country over marriage too. I mean, one of the remarkable things about this coming full circle is you have the first successful lawsuit in 1990, and then that period during the special session in late 2013 is the last time that this is in the political sphere in any state in the country, because the momentum from the Windsor decision that came down from the Supreme Court that June basically takes over everything. And so you have both state and federal courts that interpret the Windsor decision beyond what it seems like the Supreme Court necessarily intended it to say, and strike down state bans. And you have also a decision by pro-marriage equality campaigners to basically abandon the traditional political process in the states. They'd been preparing to go to the ballot in 2014 and 2016 in some states like Ohio and Michigan to try to rescind these constitutional bans. And they basically say we are putting the politics to the side and focusing entirely on the courts, and then also trying to move public opinion so that the justices of the Supreme Court ultimately will see this as a, popular issue where they are not going against national public opinion. But so that's the last time anywhere in the country, you have hearings, votes on any of this. And I should note, I don't know if this is rises to the level of factoid, but the only reason, one thing is different about Hawaii's constitutional amendment. There were 36 states passed constitutional bans on same-sex marriage. I believe Hawaii's is the only one that is written in such a way that just specifies, most states said marriage in the state is between one man and one woman, or nothing in this constitution should be construed to see marriage as something that's not between one man and one woman. And Hawaii says courts cannot construe this, but leaves the opening for the legislature. And I believe that was Dan Foley, I believe with Terrence Tom, that you sort of negotiated.
Let's find the answer to that, because this is a secret not revealed in the book, but I have a feeling that the answer is here today.
That was from my friends in the Senate Judiciary Committee. Terrence Tom was my dear friend and law school classmate. We had a very nice relationship, but on this issue, not so good. But in the Senate had been very good to us up until the 96 election, and the Senate Judiciary Chair, Ray Gralty, lost his seat for standing up against the constitutional amendment. And the chair was taken over by co-chairs, Avery Chumbley, Matt Matsunaga, Mike McCartney, and Wayne Metcalf, liberal progressive Democrats. And they felt real bad. But they said, Senate President says it's got to move. The House, there was no question, it was always going to pass. So we're going to pass the constitutional amendment in the 97 session. And, it was paired up to sort of ease their conscience with a Reciprocal Beneficiary Act, which was the first civil unions bill to pass. California and Vermont came later. But what I was able to do, because these guys felt kind of guilty, was to get that language in that Sasha mentioned, rather than an absolute ban, just to authorize the legislature. And that came because some of the legislators, like another law school classmate of mine, Randy Iwase, he would argue against the court decision, saying they stepped over they're bound, they're legislating. This is an issue for the legislature. We're not necessarily against same-sex marriage, but it's an issue for the legislature. So I took those words from our opponents, said, okay, well, let's frame the proposed constitutional amendment just to give it to the legislature, as opposed to have a ban. And then that turned out to be the key in the 2013 session. They didn't need a constitutional amendment. All they needed was a bill, and 14 states had already legalized gay marriage by that time. The President of the United States supported it. Public opinion was moving for it, so it was an easier thing to do.
We have an interesting question that came in from an audience member. And by the way, for everyone who's listening in, please feel free to ask questions. Everyone's available. Just put your question into the chat or into the Q&A. There's two little tabs at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And the question is, as a gay Lutheran pastor with a supportive congregation on Oahu, I'm wondering if you had support in the 1990s from any Christian churches or other faith communities.
We did, but it's as suggested earlier, they were smaller churches. They were small Protestant churches, Church at the Crossroads, Unitarian Church. They were smaller churches. We also had some support from Buddhist churches, Zen, Tibetan, Hongwaji. In fact, I met with the largest Buddhist church shortly after the May 93 decision. Bishop Fujitani had brought all of his Buddhist priests together and had me come and speak to them and said, Dan, explain to them what's happening. So I explained the lawsuit, Judge Levinson's decision, all of that. So Bishop Fujitani turns to his priests, they're all there, and says, okay, what do we do? What should we do? You know, just very open question. So one Japanese elder man, Japanese born, spoke English as a second language and said, Bishop Fujitani, I have a suggestion. You know, as old guys that were born and raised in Japan, we feel kind of uncomfortable with this. But these young guys that were born and raised in the United States, they're comfortable with it. So let them do the same-sex marriages. And that was it, you know, and left it at that. So we did have churches, but the major churches, the Catholics, which have big numbers, the Mormons, not the numbers, but the organization and the money. And as Scott was pointing out, even then the evangelicals were growing and active. The churches we had didn't compete with the churches against us.
We have another question coming in. Can any of the panelists talk about the tension between the national organizations and the local organizations along the lines of what Sasha mentioned at the beginning of the talk within Protect Our Constitution in the 98 vote back then?
You know, there was, as Sasha described, the national organizations didn't want to have anything to do with us. And then after the May 93 decision, that changed with Evan Wolfson, who was an attorney who had done a friend of the court brief, who had always believed in marriage, but could not swing his organization, Lambda Legal Education and Defense Fund. But after our victory with Levinson's decision, Lambda changed and jumped on board and agreed to pay our costs and help us with the litigation. So we had them. But as Sasha pointed out, Human Rights Campaign didn't come around till really 98, the year, and it was really too late. But when they did come around, they came around. They worked very hard, spent a lot of money, gave us full-time staff, but it was too late. And the ACLU was in and out, but they helped us organize locally to lobby the legislature, submitted a friend of the court brief. But, you know, after the May 93 decision, the opposition sort of subsided, and Sasha describes it well in his book, because he talks about the differences in the national organization, especially many of the feminists in the civil rights and LGBT organizations. But when the religious right came out so strong against us, as Sasha describes, one lesbian attorney in one of these roundtables said, if they're against it, we must be for it. And so they really helped bring the LGBT groups together by opposing us so strongly.
Yeah. Genora, let me ask you, by this time, I think you've moved to the mainland, if I'm right?
Yeah, I was in New York at the time.
And I wonder what it was like for you trying to help out with the cause, and were you getting a lot of grief from people or a lot of support from people?
Are we talking about the 98 vote still, or we moved on?
Well, let's compare and contrast the two times, because you were involved in both, as I know.
Yeah, I was involved. We went national. Nene and I had left Hawaii in 94. And so a lot of things had happened. And apparently Nene knew Evan Wolfson since she used to live in New York, and it was through a friend. And so one night, Evan was having a meeting with the locals here, and she basically said to him, "Hey, we need people like you." And so all of that kind of came together. I worked with Lambda, and Evan was still working there at the time. And so we went national. We hit the road, and we did a lot of fundraisers. And I learned a lot about, national versus just Hawaii politics. And so I got a really good sense of that. And again, my world started evolving, and I got more involved in that. In fact, all of the things that were happening in Hawaii, we were relayed the information, what was going back and forth. We were still in touch with Dan. We knew everything along in that sense, and until it led up before that, when the DOMA bill, we were there at the US Capitol. And interestingly enough, I guess it was presented with Lambda. We were standing there with Kevin Cathcart, who was the senior lawyer for Lambda. And we had our say. It was kind of a sad day, because we were there in front of the Capitol, and the president had signed the bill the previous night at twilight, in the middle of the night. And so Nania and I were standing there, and we were just kind of devastated, because it was on a federal level, it was a national level. But you know what? I looked at across the street, which was the U.S. Supreme Court, and I had an awakening there. I said to myself, that's where we're going to end up. And sure enough, after 96 and all the way up to 2015, I always had that, and I kept it for myself. And that was like a dream come true. And that's my participation on the national level.
I would just say that's another example of these sort of unintended consequences of how this sort of local fight from Hawaii rose nationally, which is this quite possibly would have never come to the U.S. Supreme Court, certainly not on anything like the timeline it did, had Republicans in Congress not federalized the issue with the Defense of Marriage Act. I think Dan Foley recognized this. Other attorneys in Vermont and Massachusetts afterwards recognized this, that state constitutions were a remarkable tool for this type of civil rights litigation. Each of those states had distinct provisions that do not exist in the federal constitution that would be would offer a path to making arguments about marriage discrimination. And also that up until 2003, the state sodomy laws had been upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court, and that the federal judiciary wouldn't be friendly. And so but there was not. This was not sort of something that necessarily had to end up at the U.S. Supreme Court. And the only reason they ruled in Windsor, which sort of starts that falling of dominoes that gets you the special session in late 2013, and obviously leads to the Obergefell decision 2 years after that, is because Republicans in the long run miscalculated. They won a short-term victory with DOMA, and had an impact for a while, but they actually made it something that turned this into an issue that gay marriage supporters could win at the U.S. Supreme Court instead of having to go state by state everywhere. And they ultimately provided their opponents with basically a shortcut to a national resolution.
I did want to ask that question, Daniel, because one thing I learned really new from this book was how meticulous you were to base your case on state law as versus federal law. And I think I, and probably a lot of people, just assumed that the first cases would be based on our constitutional rights to equality. And that's not a word in the Constitution really, but to equal rights and stuff. So I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about why that was done and what was the How did that work out?
Sasha spends a lot of time on this, and basically, through the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, I think that was the first real legal civil rights group. They looked to the U.S. Supreme Court, the 14th Amendment, and they had victories in Brown versus Board of Education, 1954, and then we got the Warren Court. And when I went to law school in the early 70s, all people looking to be civil rights lawyers were going to federal court. And when I became the director of the ACLU, legal director of the ACLU here in '84, I went to federal court. I didn't file in state court. But then after the impact of the Nixon appointees and whatnot, the federal courts started more conservative. And as Sasha pointed out, they had a case on the books, Bowers v. Hardwick, 1986, upholding a Georgia sodomy statute that criminalized consensual homosexual activity in the privacy of your own home. You'd go to prison for years.
Right.
So it was clear you didn't find your way to federal court. But as this was sort of bubbling up in state courts, Hawaii, Vermont, Massachusetts, all of a sudden, Justice Kennedy started having an impact in a number of cases. Romer v. Evans, where one of the lawyers, Sasha, in that case is now on the appellate courts in Hawaii, Clyde Wadsworth, A Small World. And then Lawrence v. Texas, I think it was in 2003 or so, where they overturned Bowers v. Hardwick. And Justice Scalia in dissent said, same-sex marriage is next. Watch out. And that's the first time liberals started citing Scalia, saying he's right. Lawrence v. Texas stands for same-sex marriage. And that's when it started changing, where it wasn't just state Supreme Courts anymore. It started being federal courts. And then once Windsor came along, it was over. And it didn't have to be over. And that's what was so interesting with Windsor, because I, like some lawyers, thought what the conservatives would do, what the court would do, is rule that the Congress has no power to define marriage. The conservatives have always said the federal government is a government of limited powers, express powers, states' rights. So the conservative argument was marriage historically has been in the power of the states, defined, regulated by the states, reserved to the states under the 10th Amendment. They could have gotten rid of DOMA in a very narrow way, but they attacked it frontally. And when you looked at the language of Windsor, Obergefell was inevitable 2 years later. So it changed. When I began it, state court was the only way to go, and was for the first decade or so or more. But then while this was going on, all of a sudden the federal court doors opened.
I recall that when people started realizing what Justice Kennedy's track record was and where he was headed, I recall reading an article that about Justice Kennedy, and he had I think it's a childhood friend, like his best friend from childhood, who was gay, and how that just had made a profound impact on Justice Kennedy throughout his life and his career.
That really goes to what Dean and Sasha were discussing earlier about how public opinion changes. And judges are people, believe it or not. And the fifth vote in the Bowers v. Hardwick case, Lewis Powell, had 3 law clerks, a woman who he would not let be involved in the case because it was sodomy, women shouldn't look at that. He had a very out Mormon law clerk and a very closeted gay law clerk. And Justice Powell later said, I think in the New York Times in an interview, said it was the one decision he regretted. And his former law clerk said, if I'd only come out to Justice Kennedy and talked to him, that whole federal legal history may have been differently.
It is a lot about individuals. I knew that individual. He used to hang out at gay bars in Washington, D.C., actually. It wasn't too popular. I see in our audience, actually, we have quite a few people that have been involved in this fight from the very beginning. David McEwen is here, and that organization, this really had a big difference in terms of lobbying and raising money and raising awareness, and they continue on today. I saw Blake Oshiro is here someplace, who was he speaker, or he was the whip, or he was very much involved in the legislature at the time. I think Justice Levinson was here, who of course wrote the critical decision, which will be cited forever in the law books as one of the pioneering decisions of all time. I'm going to.
Can I say one more word?
Yep.
Since you mentioned Dr. David? I know the Legacy Foundation, since I finished up my research in Hawaii, has consolidated a number of different archival sources that I believe are all now together at the UH Manoa Library. And those things have been scattered in different places when I went looking for them, but they're the papers of HERMP, which is the most oddly named advocacy organization. You can imagine, the Hawaii Equal Rights Marriage Project. And I think Dr. David's personal papers from his work on AIDS issues. And I spent a lot of time trying to chase these things down in different places. And it is very nice to know that they're being, taken care of and made, by archivists, and being made available to future researchers and anybody who's out there. I think there's still a lot more work to be done on various aspects of this. And I just want to, do my part.
And one thing they now have, courtesy of the Hawaii Supreme Court, is a complete set on thumb drive of all the legal filings in the Bear case.
Oh, wow. That's wonderful. Okay.
That's great. And at UH Manoa, it is the AIDS and Same Gender Marriage Archive. And I'm actually looking forward to perusing that myself as soon as everybody is vaccinated over at UH. I was just going to throw out, since we talk about individuals, we talked earlier about if we hadn't had marriage in the Supreme Court case in Hawaii, what would have happened in the rest of the country. I'm curious, what do you think, if there had not been Mr. Woods, what would have happened in Hawaii? Would we have had the marriage case?
No, absolutely not. It took, Bill Woods was a very controversial guy. And I think Sasha, and I knew Bill well, worked with him a lot. Some people wouldn't. And I think Sasha really treats him fairly and describes him well. But Bill, the phrase is warts and all, he got stuff done. He really did. That same session in 91, a bill passed the legislature prohibiting employment discrimination. Bill put that together. So it's kind of like Sasha was talking about, but for Bear, what would have happened nationally? Same thing in Hawaii. There wasn't anyone to pull those three couples together, and we had a relationship and bring it to me. So I think Bill Woods, even though he only lasted a year in the project, has to be given a ton of credit for getting this thing started.
Well, we're drawing toward the conclusion, unfortunately. It's been such a fascinating conversation. Anyone want to chip in at all about, we've had this wonderful discussion of marriage. What's next for LGBTQ equality in Hawaii, and what's going to happen?
Well, Hawaii is really in good shape. We have statutes everywhere. We have same-sex marriage. We have no employment, housing, public accommodations, discrimination based on sexual identity. Hawaii is really, at least legally, set. But we have one thing that could impact us negatively. And Sasha deals with this in the last chapter, massive desistance. We have a case currently pending with the U.S. Supreme Court under the First Amendment that would, a Catholic organization out of Philadelphia, that would allow them to deny same-sex couple adoption.
No adoption.
Under the First Amendment, freedom of religion. I think most legal scholars think with the current Supreme Court, they're going to go with the church, or the question's going to be how broad is the opinion's going to be, or incremental. And because it's the First Amendment, it would apply in Hawaii. It wouldn't undo any of our laws, but it may allow a church organization to discriminate against same-sex couples or LGBT people in general based under the First Amendment. It's that, and of course, the transgender issue, I think, fairly well protected here. The big issues, public attitudes. We need a lot of education and change there. People are way behind the curve on that one. But it's the First Amendment, religious discrimination that would impact us.
Well, thank you all. This has been really an illuminating discussion. I'm so glad to live in Hawaii, and my husband and I appreciate all the work you guys did, especially you, Genora, early on, because it's been really important for us, as it is for everybody. And tell your friends about the book. I'm just going to be available publicly, I guess, very soon. It's coming out. And we just want to all thank the LGBT Legacy Foundation and David. And Sandy, why don't you close us out?
Mahalo to all of you for joining us this evening. It is through your support that we are able to bring our Rainbow Town Hall series to our community. We would like to thank Sasha Issenberg for embarking on this journey of recording and engaging LGBTQIA+ history. We would also like to thank this evening's host and moderator, Dean Hammer, and our distinguished panelists, Genora Dancel, the Honorable Dan Foley, Senator Chris Lee, and Speaker Scott Saiki. Joining us next month as we celebrate the 30th anniversary of our Honolulu AIDS Walk and 40 years since Dr. David McEwen diagnosed the first AIDS case in Hawaii, leading him to revolutionize our approach to care and prevention. Mahalo.